Hello everybody, it's Margaret here with Free Tours by Foot, and today I'm in Paris to take you on a virtual tour of the most visited cemetery in the world, Père Lachaise. Père Lachaise was the first municipal cemetery in Paris and was named after the confessor to King Louis XIV, Père François de Lachaise. He lived in a house that was located on the site of where the chapel in the cemetery, which we'll see later, stands today. The property surrounding that house was bought by the city in 1804, and a cemetery was established here by Napoleon in the same year. Laid out by neoclassical architect Alexandre Théodore Rognard, who was inspired by English-style gardens, the cemetery was deliberately designed with uneven paths, lined with a mix of various types of trees and plants. However, initially, the cemetery remained nearly empty. Parisians considered it too far from the city, and many Roman Catholics refused to be buried here as the land had not been blessed by the church. Today, there are over 1 million bodies buried in Père Lachaise, but in its opening year, the cemetery was home to only 13 graves. But the administrators had an idea to drum up interest. They organized the transfer of the remains of two of France's greatest literary figures, Jean de La Fontaine and Moliere, to Père Lachaise, and with much fanfare, celebration, and public interest, the two men were reinterred here. Interest in the cemetery slowly grew, and the administrators repeated their trick with the purported remains of Pierre Abelard, a medieval French philosopher and poet, and his student and wife, Héloïse d'Argentoul. Shortly after, people were clamoring to be buried in Père Lachaise, and by 1830, the cemetery contained more than 33,000 graves. The largest cemetery in Paris, at 110 acres, Père Lachaise is the final resting place of some of the world's most notable figures, the graves of many of whom we'll be visiting today. The first of which is that of Edith Piaf. No matter when you visit Père Lachaise, you're likely to find fresh flowers on the grave of famed singer and native Parisian Edith Piaf. Although much of Edith's early life is unclear, she was abandoned by her singer and circus performer mother and was raised for some time in a brothel run by her grandmother. Despite tough circumstances, she rose to international stardom in the 1930s, a symbol of French passion and perseverance. Chances are you've heard at least one of her songs, the most famous of which, of course, is La Vie en Rose, also the name of the biographical film about Edith released in the year 2007. Plagued by health problems and alcoholism throughout her life, Edith died in 1963 of what is believed to be liver failure at her villa on the French Riviera. It is said that her husband secretly drove her body back to Paris so fans would think she had died in her hometown. Her funeral procession drew thousands, grinding the streets of Paris to a halt, and it's estimated that more than 100,000 fans were in attendance during her burial ceremony here at Père Lachaise. She's buried with her father, Louis Alphonse Gassion, as well as her daughter Marcelle, who predeceased her at the age of 2, and her second husband, Theo Serapo. During the Second World War, when France was occupied, the country was split into 2 zones. It's estimated that around 12,500 French Jews were transported from the northern German-occupied zone across Europe. This section of the cemetery that we're walking towards now is home to a number of memorials commemorating those, as well as other, victims of concentration and extermination camps. Here, you'll find monuments erected to those who suffered in places like Mauthausen, Neuengamme, Ravensbrück, Auschwitz. This is probably the most visited. Buchenwald. And, in my opinion, the most striking, Oranienburg. This is the grave of American-born writer Gertrude Stein. Stein was a poet, storyteller, patron of the arts, and an early feminist figure. She relocated from California to Paris in 1903 at the age of 29, where she hosted a well-known salon, which was attended by figures such as Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, Henri Matisse, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, just to name a few. She lived in Paris until her death from stomach cancer in 1946. From 1907 until her death in 1946, Gertrude was in a committed relationship with her life partner, Alice Toklas, seen here on the right. Toklas is buried here with Stein in this simple grave. You see Gertrude's name on the front, and all the visitation stones, a Jewish custom that visitors have left on the headstone, and Alice's name here on the back. As we walk, you can see how crowded the cemetery is. In fact, it's actually full. But that doesn't mean it's impossible to be buried here, because at Père Lachaise, many of the deceased won't be here forever. To save money, many people choose to lease a plot at the cemetery for a limited time, say for 10, 30, or even 50 years. Once time is up, the grave inhabitants are moved to another graveyard in nearby regions like Normandy or Champagne, or wherever there happens to be space. When a grave is removed, somebody else is then able to be put inside. This means that these days, when you purchase a plot, you don't get to choose where it is, as you'll just end up wherever there happens to be a vacated space. Most burials nowadays are members of families that already have graves here, and the newly deceased are simply joining the family plot, although this can be an expensive process, as the grave must be dug up, the coffins exhumed, the hole in the ground made deeper, and everybody put back inside again. It's a process that costs thousands and thousands of euros. However, only those who have died in Paris or have lived there are permitted to be buried inside, and the wait list is currently somewhere between 30 to 50 years long. It's quite an exclusive little club these days. No wonder people are just dying to get in. Yeah, I said it. These days, the majority of people choosing Père Lachaise as their final resting place wind up here. Just behind the trees is the crematorium, carrying out dozens of cremations every day. The ashes can then be spread in this part of the cemetery. Just here, you can see the memorial garden, a place to lay flowers or trinkets to commemorate those who have had their ashes spread in this area. Just up from the memorial garden is the next of our famous cemetery residents, and my personal favorite inhabitant of Père Lachaise. This is the final resting place of Oscar Wilde, the noted Irish poet and playwright, author of works such as The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Importance of Being Earnest. After finding international fame and success, both from his profession and his role in the aesthetic movement, Wilde became infamous as a defendant in one of the world's first celebrity trials in 1895. Accused of gross indecency with men by the father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, he was found guilty and sentenced to the maximum penalty of 2 years' hard labor, from which he never truly recovered. Oscar died at the age of 46 on the 30th of November, 1900, from meningitis, although the origin of his disease is a subject of debate. He was originally buried in a cemetery outside the city, but he was reinterred here at Père Lachaise in 1909. His tomb is quite divisive. It was commissioned by Wilde's devoted friend Robert Ross, who, at his own request, had his ashes interred in the tomb on the 50th anniversary of his dear friend's death in 1950. Designed by sculptor Sir Jacob Epstein, the tomb is said to draw inspiration from Wilde's poem, The Sphinx. It depicts a modernist Syrian-style angel who is previously anatomically correct, but the current whereabouts of the original genitalia are unknown. Rumor had it for some time that the testicles were being used as paperweights in the administration office of the cemetery. Unlike the other graves in the cemetery, you'll notice that Oscar's is covered by a glass barrier. It was erected in 2011 in an attempt to stop the tradition of people kissing the tomb. For decades, it's become popular for guests to freshen their lipstick and kiss the tomb, leaving a print of their lips. Unfortunately, the animal fat in most lipsticks sinks into the stone and can cause permanent damage, and the cleaning of the stone simply served to make it more porous. Ireland's Office of Public Works considers the tomb an Irish overseas monument and, tired of paying for the constant cleaning, instead ordered the construction of the barrier. It's worth noting that the barrier has to be removed every now and again to clear out the alcoholic drinks, packets of cigarettes, and condoms that people tend to leave in the space between the barrier and the stone tomb. I'm not sure if that's better or worse than the kissing. As we continue our walk, you'll notice just how far the cemetery stretches. Technically speaking, it's the largest park in Paris and contains more than 5,000 trees. We're headed toward the next stop on our tour to see the grave of Victor Noir. His name may not be the most recognized of those who are buried at Père Lachaise, but his grave is one of the most visited locations in the cemetery. Victor was a journalist in 19th century France, at a time of great social and political upheaval. At the time, the country was divided between Republicans and monarchists, also known as Loyalists. The editor of the newspaper that Victor worked for, named Pascal Grosset, a Republican, became involved in a dispute with Prince Pierre Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon and cousin of then Emperor Napoleon III, a monarchist, over articles written in two competing newspapers. A duel was suggested as a means to resolve the issue. Grosset chose Victor Noir as one of his seconds for the duel, and sent him to Bonaparte's house to fix the terms of the duel. Bonaparte was offended that these, quote, menials had been sent to speak with him, and demanded to deal with the owner of the newspaper directly. There are two accounts of what happened next. Victor Noir's companion claimed that Noir, offended at being referred to as a menial, argued with the prince, who then slapped Noir and shot him dead. Bonaparte claimed it was Noir himself who hit him first, angry with being referred to as a menial. After being slapped by Victor, the prince drew his revolver and fired at his assailant. It was the latter version accepted by the court, although being the cousin of the emperor, I'm sure had nothing to do with the result of the trial. Victor's murder and Pierre's acquittal, at a time when the emperor was already deeply unpopular, caused public outrage and violent demonstrations. Victor became a symbol of the Republican fight, and it's said more than 100,000 people joined his funeral procession. Originally buried elsewhere, Victor's body was moved to Père Lachaise after the overthrowing of the emperor's regime, and a bronze statue was sculpted to mark his grave. Created by Jules Dalou, the sculpture is meant to depict Victor as though he has just fallen to the ground after being shot, dropping his hat beside him. There's a notable protuberance in Victor's trousers, and at some point in time, this has become the focus of a number of visitors' attentions. A myth states that leaving a flower in Victor's hat, kissing his statue on the lips, or indeed rubbing that particular spot just above his left leg, will enhance fertility, or even bring a husband to you within the year. You'll notice quite quickly the parts of the statue that receive the most tactical attention, as they are prominently shiny and well worn. Just as with Oscar Wilde's tomb, a fence was erected around the grave to protect it from further amorous attention in 2004, but the public outcry was so great it was eventually torn down. If by chance you find the whole thing rather strange, I'd point out that some people have photographed themselves touching, kissing, and straddling Noir statue and posted the pictures online. Not that I've looked, of course. At the start of the tour, I told you that Père Lachaise reinterred the bodies of some well-known French figures to drum up the popularity of the cemetery. One of those was Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, better known as Moliere, who died in 1673, over 100 years before his final resting place was even built. Moliere is in the tomb on the four plinths. A celebrated playwright, actor, and poet, he's considered by some to be the greatest writer in the French language, and his death became the stuff of legend. During a performance of his own work, The Imaginary Invalid, and while playing the role of a man faking his own death, Moliere collapsed on stage in a coughing fit and began to hemorrhage. At first, the audience assumed he was simply acting, and Moliere insisted on completing his performance. At the end of the show, during the thunderous applause of the audience, who would not find out until the following day what they had actually witnessed, Moliere collapsed and was taken home where he would die without absolution. This was particularly unfortunate, as in the 17th century, actors were considered sinners by their very profession, and were required to renounce their jobs and to be delivered of the last rites by a priest before death, to be considered for burial in consecrated ground. Moliere's widow begged the king to allow her husband to be buried, which he was, secretly and at night. Legend said he was permitted to only be buried in the part of a cemetery reserved for unbaptized infants as a compromise, though this is disputed. Regardless, today Moliere has done well for himself, with a splendid tomb raised up on four plinths, surrounded by an iron fence. His grave is much visited, and of course his burial here in 1817 helped bring about the cemetery's popularity, paving the way for Père Lachaise to become the iconic location it is today. Not too bad for a man who was considered too sinful to have a graveyard burial in the first place. Note that next to him lies the grave of another figure moved here a century after his death, Jean de La Fontaine, a noted French fabulist and translator of Aesop's famous stories. I mentioned to you earlier that there's still a crematorium in usage here at Père Lachaise. Up ahead of us here is one of the old cemetery crematoria, one of the first to be built in all of France. The tall column that looks somewhat like a monument of some kind is actually the old chimney to a single cremator. The cremations today, however, take place in the main crematorium, and the chimneys there are mostly concealed by a dome. The dome was originally built to discreetly cover the true work of the building, owing to the sensibilities of the nearby residents, as up until 1963 the Catholic Church forbade cremations. Eventually, however, cremations at Père Lachaise became so popular that a Columbarium needed to be constructed in 1894, a building solely dedicated to the storage of cremains. There are some well-known figures resting inside, such as Paul Landowski, Pierre Duc, Maria Callas, and Isadora Duncan, tragically killed when the scarf she was wearing tangled in the spokes of a convertible she was riding in the south of France. This is the tomb of Eugène Delacroix, a French Romantic artist and leader of the French Romantic school. He was considered one of the last old masters of painting, and is one of the few to have been captured by a camera. Perhaps his most famous work is Liberty Leading the People, a depiction of the July Revolution that removed King Charles X from the throne. The central figure has become a symbol of France herself. Delacroix died in 1863 from an unknown illness, and, in his will, he forbade any representation of his features in the future, so his tomb bears no depictions of the man himself. This interesting tomb is the final resting place of Hubertine Auclert, an important figure in French feminism. She campaigned tirelessly for not only the right for women to vote, but also to have the same social, legal, political, and working rights as men. She was active both politically, delivering important public speeches to distinguished bodies such as the Socialist Workers' Congress, and militantly, sneaking into wedding ceremonies to heckle when the article stating that a woman owes, quote, submission and obedience to her husband was read out. She also organized a tax strike, stating that if the administration excluded women from voting, then they should also be excluded from taxes, as well as a census strike stating, quote, "If we don't count, why are we counted?" Hubertine continued her activism throughout her life, writing articles, delivering speeches, and illegally standing for elections until her death at the age of 66 in 1914. Unfortunately, she didn't live to see her dream realized. Women in France weren't given the right to vote until 1944, but she was given this unique resting place among some of France's greatest names. And opposite that, of Honore de Balzac. A French novelist and playwright, de Balzac is regarded as one of the founders of realism in European literature. He was born in 1799 with the surname Balzac, and added the de himself, it being an indicator of names with aristocratic origin. He moved to Paris at the age of 20 and began writing, becoming particularly known for his published series. From his early 30s until his death, he traveled all around Europe and, on his travels, he met a Polish countess, Eve de Balzac, who's buried here alongside her husband. Honore's intense travel schedule and writing regimen wreaked havoc on his health, and he died of a heart attack at the young age of 51. His funeral was attended by, quote, "almost every writer in Paris," and Victor Hugo himself was a pallbearer and delivered the eulogy. His grave features a bronze sculpture by Pierre Jean David Angery, as well as a quill and a bronze depiction of his greatest work, La Comédie Humaine. We're now going to take a bit of a walk southwards, and I'll be quiet to let you enjoy the views. We'll pass many interesting graves along the way. We now arrive at the grave of Polish-born Frederic Chopin, one of the most beloved composers of all time. A virtuoso pianist, by the age of 15, Chopin was already performing for such people as the Tsar Alexander I, who was so impressed by the young musician's talent that he gifted him a diamond ring. Responsible for developing new techniques for playing the piano, Chopin's personal life was also high profile, with a number of publicized love affairs. Plagued by ill health throughout his life, he died at the age of only 39. Chopin himself is buried here at Père Lachaise, but his heart lies elsewhere. In a romantic gesture to his homeland, and at the musician's request, his heart was preserved in a glass jar and smuggled into Warsaw after his death, thought to be from tuberculosis, in 1849. His funeral was held at the Church of the Madeleine in Paris and was attended by over 3,000 people, many of whom then followed the funeral procession to Père Lachaise. Delacroix, whom we visited earlier, was one of the pallbearers. His tomb features the statue of Euterpe, the Muse of Music. Designed and sculpted by Clasongy, the figure is seen mourning and weeping over a broken lyra. This is one of the best kept tombs in the cemetery, and it's rare to find it unadorned without flowers or tokens. Occasionally, you may even hear his music as you approach, as many people choose to play his pieces while they pay their respects. How about we listen to some Chopin as we continue? This imposing monument is the tomb of Casimir Pierre Perier, a prominent French banker and statesman who served as prime minister from March 1831 until his death from the cholera epidemic in 1832. This tomb mausoleum was built in 1837 from a mix of government and public funds. Created by sculptor Jean-Pierre Couture, a figure of Perier himself stands on top of the structure, and below him are 3 bas-reliefs representing eloquence, justice, and strength. Our next stop is one of the most popular grave sites in the cemetery, the final resting place of musician Jim Morrison. Lead singer of the rock band The Doors, Jim Morrison has gone down in history as one of the most influential frontmen of rock and roll. Soaring to fame with the release of The Doors' single Light My Fire, Morrison was at the height of his fame when he died, unexpectedly of an accidental drug overdose, in Paris at the age of 27 in 1971, landing him a top spot as a member of the mythical but legendary 27 Club. Morrison was buried in Père Lachaise, and initially his grave had no official marker, so fans made one of their own, and his name was incorrectly listed in the cemetery directory as Douglas James Morrison. French officials placed a marker on the grave in 1973, which was promptly stolen. In 1981, a Croatian sculptor, Mladen Mikulin, received permission from the cemetery to place a marble bust of his own design and a new gravestone on top of Morrison's resting place to commemorate the 10-year anniversary of his death. However, the bust was defaced and stolen in 1988. Finally, in 1990, Morrison's father had a flat stone placed on the grave, bearing a Greek inscription that reads, quote, "True to his own spirit." Owing to the continued problems both with theft of the grave markers here, the once attempted removal of Jim's body, and the litter of burning candles, bottles of wine, underwear, condoms, and drug paraphernalia left on the gravesite, the plot is now mostly blocked off from the public. This may seem like an inconvenience to the administrators at Père Lachaise, but it's worth noting that when Jim Morrison was first buried here, his plot was bought for a period of 50 years. But Jim is still here at the behest of the cemetery, who don't want to let him go, harkening back to the original owner's desire of celebrity burials bringing prestige, attention, and tourism to Père Lachaise. And our last stop at Jim Morrison's grave will be the final one we make on our virtual tour today. Père Lachaise is so vast, with so many notable burials, that it's nearly impossible to put them all together in a single tour, one that wouldn't be 6 hours long anyway. If I've forgotten any of your favorites, I do apologize. Feel free to comment below if there are any other names you would like to have seen included. Make sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more virtual tours throughout all of Europe. Check out our content and see if we've visited your favorite city yet. Thank you for joining me today on this virtual tour of beautiful Père Lachaise Cemetery. It's been a pleasure guiding you through centuries of history. Now we'll take the southwestern exit onto the Rue des Repos, back to the 21st century.